Welcome back to The Explainer. So glad you're joining us. Let's just jump right into it. Today, we're talking about something that literally forms the foundation of every single successful build or renovation, and that's flooring estimation. Now, I know, estimating sounds like basic arithmetic, right? But the financial stakes here are just incredibly high. Relying on those old-school manual methods, that doesn't just cause minor hiccups. It actively erodes your profit margins and, worse, damages client trust. So let's dive in and see how we can completely replace guesswork with a rock-solid professional system. Okay, picture this. You're on site, the team is humming along, the client is thrilled, and then, bam, progress just completely halts. You are exactly 3 rows away from finishing off this gorgeous new floor, you reach into the last box and it's empty. Have you ever experienced that mid-project panic? Man, it's just the worst sinking feeling. You're scrambling to find matching materials, your installers are just standing around on the clock, and your perfect schedule? Yeah, completely out the window. This isn't just frustrating, guys. It's a massive red flag that your estimation process is fundamentally broken. So let's do a quick reality check right here. Let's look at what actually happens when you don't calculate your materials precisely. We call this the shortage crisis. When you underorder because, maybe you skipped adding a proper waste buffer, you aren't just paying for a few extra tiles. No way. You are paying expedite delivery fees. You're paying for super expensive labor downtime while your crew literally just waits for materials. And what if that new batch comes from a totally different dye lot? The colors might not even match. But on the flip side, if you overorder out of fear, well, now you've got valuable capital tied up in unused stock that you actually have to pay to store or throw away. The shortage crisis doesn't just annoy you, it actively destroys your project budgets. So how do we avoid this mess entirely? We adopt the Pro Visual Workflow. Here's exactly what we're covering today. First, digital measurements. Second, the flooring math. Third, material variations. And finally, total boxes. All right, let's kick things off with Phase 1, digital measurements. It's time to retire the tape measure for good. Just watch this modern takeoff software in action for a second. You can see the digital highlighter tool dynamically tracing the exact perimeter of the floor plan. See those thick blue lines? They're mapping out the room right down to the precise inch. By digitizing your blueprints, you completely eliminate the human error of, misreading a tape measure on site or misinterpreting a scaled drawing. You are capturing the absolute exact geometry of the space flawlessly. But look, just drawing lines isn't enough. You have to follow professional takeoff rules. First, obviously, trace your main floor perimeter. Second, and honestly, estimators miss this one all the time, you absolutely must calculate and add the perimeter length for any skirting or baseboards if they're made from the same material. And third, explicitly subtract those door openings. If you don't use your tool to subtract the doors, you're literally paying for tile that will never ever be installed. Precision means accounting for every single inch of empty space. Which brings us right to our next rule: isolate your measurements. Instead of trying to calculate the square footage of an entire house in one massive error-prone equation, modern software lets you isolate everything room by room. Notice that room menu on the left? By organizing your data like that, room 103, 104, 105, you can easily handle irregular shapes like alcoves or bay windows without making huge aggregate math errors. Plus, if a client suddenly decides to change the flooring in just one room, boom, your data's already perfectly segmented. Moving right along to Phase 2, the flooring math. This is all about precision over guesswork. Take a good look at this split screen. On the left side, we have the core professional formula. To find your total area, you add your floor area to your skirting area, and then you multiply that combined number by 1 plus your wastage percentage. It's that simple. On the right, let's make this a bit more tangible with an example. Say you have a standard 10 by 10 foot room plus a 4-inch skirting height around the whole perimeter. You calculate that base square footage first. Then, if your waste factor is 10%, you multiply that whole thing by 1.10. It's a completely systematic, unbreakable mathematical process. But hold on, speaking of that 10%, we really need to talk about one of the most dangerous habits in this industry. I call it the just add 10% myth. So many amateur estimators just blindly apply a generic 10% waste buffer to every single project they do, totally regardless of the room, the material, or the pattern. Let me be super clear about this. Treating 10% as some kind of universal golden rule is exactly how you end up in that shortage crisis we talked about earlier. Which perfectly sets up Phase 3, material variations, and exactly why geometry matters. Basically, the material you choose completely dictates the math you use. For instance, think Think about large format tiles, like a 600 by 1200 millimeter tile. They require entirely different wastage percentages compared to smaller tiles just because of the sheer cutting complexity. And this chart visually proves the variance by pattern too. A standard straight lay hardwood floor? Sure, that might only need a 5% buffer. A diagonal tile layout jumps to 10%. But look at a herringbone tile pattern. You need anywhere from 15% to 22% extra material just to cover the waste. If you applied that just add 10% myth to a herringbone layout, there is no way around it. You would run out of materials with a quarter of the room still left to go. So why exactly does herringbone eat up so much material? Well, it all comes down to the angles. In a straight lay, you get these nice rectangular offcuts that you can easily just reuse on the other side of the room. But in a herringbone pattern, your tiles sit at a 45-degree angle to the walls. When you cut that tile to sit flush against the wall, you create what's called a triangular offcut. This is a non-reusable scrap. Because you cut it at a 45-degree angle, you can almost never reuse it without cutting it down again into an even smaller, totally useless piece. And unfortunately, triangles aren't your only enemy here. There are hidden danger zones in literally any complex layout. Look at these hidden material eaters. You've got the starting ramp-up rows where the zigzag pattern begins, the finishing ramp-down rows at the far wall, and honestly, the absolute worst offender, cutting around obstacles like kitchen islands or custom vanity cabinets. But here's a pro tip. Shifting your starting point by just a few inches in your digital software can actually balance out these edge cuts and save you entire boxes of material. It's a real game changer.
Now, let's connect all this geometry back to where it hurts, your wallet. If we take a modest 200 square foot room using, say, an $8 per square foot tile, just look at the financial difference. For a straight lay, your waste costs between $80 and $160. Totally manageable, right? But for that stunning herringbone pattern, the waste alone is going to cost you between $240 and $352. That is a massive difference. You absolutely have to ensure that extra cost is built into the client's quote upfront instead of letting it eat into your own profit margins. Oh, and here is a surprising fact that catches even seasoned veterans totally off guard. Do not forget the grout. Complex layouts don't just waste tile. Because you have so many more cut pieces and staggered joints, a diagonal or herringbone pattern actually requires 10 to 15% more grout to fill the space compared to a standard straight layout. If you don't account for this, I guarantee you'll be making a frantic, midday emergency run to the hardware store for a single bag of grout. All right, we made it to the final step, total boxes. This is the ultimate metric. Because here is the undeniable truth of the construction industry. Suppliers sell by the box, not by the exact square foot. And this is especially vital depending on your local context. For example, since we operate right here in Pakistan, we know that local suppliers almost exclusively quote and sell by the carton or the box. So doing all this math and figuring out you need exactly 314.5 square feet of tile, it's completely useless if you don't translate that number into the language of the supplier. This final conversion is honestly the most valuable takeaway for your entire workflow. So here is your totally foolproof 3-step procedure to guarantee your purchase order is perfect. Step 1, take your total area and add your highly specific pattern-based waste percentage. Step 2, look at the manufacturer's spec sheet and divide your total area by the square footage contained in a single box. And step 3, always round up to the next whole box. If the math says you need 42.1 boxes, no question, you order 43. And that really brings us full circle. By utilizing the ProVisual workflow, tracing digitally, calculating the exact area and skirting, adjusting waste for those tricky geometric patterns, and finally correctly converting to supplier boxes, precision planning completely replaces the shortage crisis. You trade manual guessing for rock-solid digital math. And doing that protects your capital, respects your project timeline, and secures predictable profitability on every single job. So, I'm going to leave you with this provocative question to chew on as you prepare for your next job. Is your next project's budget based on a hopeful guess, or is it based on the undeniable math? It is time to ditch the tape measure, completely ditch that 10% myth, and let the math drive your success. Thank you so much for joining me in this explainer today, and I really encourage you to apply this structured workflow to your very next takeoff.